Sweet. Well, we are here and we are live on the final day of the 2019 Virtual Kombucha Conference. It probably, most definitely will be an annual one, so why don't we add that to it, the annual Virtual Kombucha Conference. And we've had an amazing 4 days of knowledge sharing, of interaction on the forum, talking about all things kombucha, fermentation. We talked about, oh my goodness, so many things. The world of tea, scoby, fashion, and materials. Starting a kombucha company. What else did we talk about? The magic of fermentation. And of course, I'm sure everybody's favorite is that how to perfect your home kombucha brew. So if you want more information or if you want to join and check out the presentation, you can always go to virtualkombuchaconference.com to check it all out. But to close out the conference, I'm here with two really special guests that I'm super pumped about the opportunity to talk to these two awesome people in the fermentation and kombucha world, and I'm sure you are as well. I'm here with the president and co-founder of Kombucha Brewers International, and also the co-founder of Kombucha Camp, the author of the big book of kombucha, which I'm sure all you booch heads have in your fermentation library, the kombucha mama herself, out for a walk on a beautiful day in California. Hannah Crum, welcome, Hannah.
Hey, thanks for having me, Drew. Excited to be here and answer everybody's questions.
Right on. And our other special guest to close out the conference is New York Times best-selling author of The Art of Fermentation. He speaks all over the world about bubbles and fermentation. He also presented at the Virtual Kombucha Conference on the magic of fermentation. And he is also a fermentation revivalist. Sandor Katz, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to hearing what kind of questions are on people's minds.
Right on. Well, before we get into the weeds of fermentation and kombucha, I thought I would start, just take a quick step back, because in your presentation, Sandor, at the very end, I thought it was really interesting. Obviously you talked about the magic of fermentation throughout the whole thing, but then at the end, this idea of fermentation as a catalyst for social change, and that all of us are the starter cultures, and it kind of left this gaping hole of me just wanting to know more about what that actually means and where you're going with that. So maybe we just start with fermentation as a catalyst for social change and what role we have as starter cultures in that place of fermentation.
Well, I just think that the metaphors of fermentation are really very powerful. And if you start, once you start thinking about it, you start noticing that, in all kinds of, news analysis articles, the fermentation is used as a metaphor. And so if, fermentation has always been recognized by bubbles, the metaphor really is about like people getting bubbly, and any state of like social agitation is sometimes referred to as fermentation. So in that sense, I mean, I think that fermentation really is an engine of social change, and I think that we're living in a time of incredible changes and and really I would say kind of high stakes. And so, this idea of social fermentation, of, people who are, concerned with, different aspects of our collective existence, creating some agitation, creating some bubbles, working towards creating change. It is an important kind of fermentation.
Interesting. And Hannah, I mean, I think the kombucha industry is so interesting in terms of their part that they play in that addressing some of these concerns that I'm sure Sandra was alluding to, that we have our aspects of our existence. How does the kombucha industry contribute to that, and how do you see kombucha as a role in what Sandra was talking about?
Well, we're already disrupting the beverage market. Sodas are losing market share and they're losing out to functional beverages. And kombucha, as a fermented tea, happens to be one of those beverages that's really causing major food manufacturing firms to look and say, hey, maybe we need to do something with fermentation. Unfortunately, oftentimes when they get into it, they then apply their food processing techniques. And so that's one of the challenges we're struggling with as an industry, is how do we protect authenticity of the fermentation of the craft of what kombucha is, because it's such a recent industry. It really is still very much that like homebrew sort of sentimentality and ethic around it. How do we work together as an industry to make sure that consumers have the most authentic brew on their plates as well? But we can clearly see that consumers are wanting things that are different, that have that additional functionality to them. And I think a really great book to read on this subject is The Revolution Will Not Be Door Cats. Oh, he gets out of
Looks like Hannah dropped down a rabbit hole in the park in California. I'm sure she'll be back.
She was just referencing one of my earlier books, which is called "The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved: Inside America's Underground Food Movements." And that book is all about grassroots movements to reclaim food in different ways.
Hmm. And how do you see? I mean, you've seen and been a part of that movement of change and activism. Where are we today? And if I'm an attendee of the virtual kombucha conference, or if I'm a kombucha enthusiast and I'm just getting my feet wet in the world of fermentation, I think it's an interesting role to think that you can play. As a consumer, but also as a participant. So where do you see it moving now? And like, where are we today, and how can we kind of participate in that?
Well, I mean, to my mind, and part of why I have, been sort of doing so much work encouraging people to not be intimidated by fermentation, to, try fermenting some stuff at home, is I think that, it's really important for us to step out of the role of consumer. It is not sustainable for us to just consume. We need to find a more balanced role where, in addition to consuming, people can play a role in producing. And I think that, kombucha is a wonderful opportunity for this. I mean, I certainly mean, no disrespect for any of the, people who have begun, business enterprises. I mean, clearly there's a huge demand and, they're trying to fill that demand. But I think that there's really a, like a special magic and power in people making it for themselves. If I hear one more person whine about the price of kombucha, I mean, it's the easiest thing in the world to make yourself. It costs, pennies per glass if you make it yourself. And, there's so much information, whether it's, Hannah's book or my book or, 1,000 YouTube videos that people could watch. So, I mean, I just think that for people to take, some small item, whether it's making their kombucha or making some sauerkraut or learning how to bake bread for themselves, but, just breaking out of this passive role of being a consumer and, find a way to make something that you can not only use to nourish yourself and your family and your friends, but that maybe you can then get involved with a little barter economy and trade some of the kombucha that you're making for the yogurt that someone else is making, or the sourdough bread that someone else is making. And I think that rebuilding these kinds of exchange networks is a really great way of reclaiming food and taking it out of just the realm of something you spend money on at the market, and something, it turns it into something that you have a direct role in, and it sort of forces you to interact with your environment, because fermentation is all about being aware of your environment and sort of thinking about all of these environmental conditions. Because the practice of fermentation in every case, is really about small manipulations of environmental conditions to encourage the growth of certain organisms and discourage the growth of others.
I've always had a passion for cooking and making my own food and entertaining and that sort of thing. So the world of kombucha was kind of natural. Kind of a natural connection with me when I kind of discovered it 2 years ago, and I'm kind of a little baby in this industry, but it's completely consumed me. And one of the really great things about it, which I experienced for the first time recently, is this idea of sharing with friends and family and passing on and making that connection, where I had made a batch of kombucha and went over to a friend's house, and we were talking about kombucha, and he said, well, this was the first time I went over, he was talking about it, and he was like, well, I really wanted to try it. He would brew his own beer and cider, but had never tried brewing his own kombucha. So a couple of weeks later, I brought over a scoby, a 1-gallon jar, some green tea, and I said, okay, here you go. And it was this moment of passing on my scoby that had grown in my home that has a connection with me, and I felt like a proud parent to kind of pass this on or pass on that gift. And he recently came over and brought he was over last night actually, and brought over his kombucha, and he was so excited to share with me and talked about the experiments that he did with it, and we just kind of created this whole conversation and connection around food and around kombucha. And I'm sure, Hannah, you've seen that. I mean, you share all sorts of equipment and recipes and things for kombucha as part of Kombucha Camp, but I'm sure on a personal level, you've done that as well too, to make those connections.
Oh, well, I mean, sharing is definitely part of the fun, and being creative and getting that feedback. And even if I just bring my kombucha to a restaurant and I have it sitting on the table, the colors, the energy that it gives off, everyone else is like, ooh, where do I get a bottle of that? So it is exciting to share that with other people, and it's such a great outlet for creativity. But it really is philosophy here at Kombucha Camp, and I know that of course Sandor has a lifelong habit of educating others, which is great, and that's really what the whole conference is about, is being able to get this information to people's hands, to demystify the process, to remind them that food and fermentation is something that have been with humans for since the dawn of time. And it's daunting sometimes because we are confused about that process, but I think it's so simple to start just with, cabbage and salt, right? Like, you don't get into it. It's so, and it really then, of its own accord, just of its own true nature, bubbles forth, and people can't help but then know that you are now a fermentationist because you end up sharing that with other people in your life. It makes you feel good, and you want to pass that feeling forward.
Mm-hmm. And so we talked a little bit about home brewing, and we did you touched on prices of kombucha and that sort of thing. We did have a question from one of our viewers on YouTube, Vulpix, had asked, he had just watched, or she had just watched the most recent video on starting a kombucha business. So this one's for you, Hannah. And the question was around profitability, which I'm sure everybody wants to know. If I'm starting a business, how do I make money doing it? As well as sharing their passion for kombucha. Is there any sort of rule of thumbs, or are there volumes that you're looking at getting to where you need to kind of get to certain thresholds if you're planning that out? Is there a, I don't know, is there a plan or kind of a rule of thumb that you would say that there is for starting and then saying, okay, now I'm ready to start scaling, and then when's the next level of scalability?
Well, so I mean, profitability is always an issue whenever you go into business for yourself. And really, it's more, if you have the passion for this, and I feel like fermentation, anyone who wants to start a small business, who's not afraid of hard work because there's a lot of labor involved, and has a passion for it, like fermented foods, whether it's kombucha or kimchi or sauerkraut, and we see people who make all of those, of course, trust your gut. That's going to lead you in the right direction. The thing that I see in our industry right now is that everyone sells out. And what I mean by that is they run out of product because there's just so much demand for it. But of course, there's going to reach a point when it doesn't, but I just don't think we're there yet. So in terms of profitability and when to expand, really, it's the demand dictates that for you. And profitability is a tricky thing because there's so much time and energy that isn't directly compensated with money. It can be difficult to calculate that. But I think people who choose slow organic growth end up really appreciating what it is they're bringing to their communities. However, if you are someone who's desirous of having that big brand and looking for investment, there are opportunities out there, but it's going to take more than just a good idea. You really have to have a solid product and really great recipes. And so more than anything, it's really sticking true to what is driving you here. Are you just looking to do this for a financial motive? Then it's probably not the right business for you, because so much education, so much, even learning how to brew on a larger scale is a difficult process to master. So it's not for the faint of heart.
Another topic that comes up all the time that we had a few questions on, that we could probably go to Sandor first and then Hannah, is around bubbles and carbonation. We all know that carbonation is a byproduct of fermentation in kombucha. And I wonder, Sandor, not specifically on kombucha, but fermentation in general, when we talk about bubbles and carbonation, it is a byproduct. And how do we control it? And what's the science behind the natural bubbles happening? And then also, what's the science behind creating more bubbles or more carbonation in our final products?
Okay, so in terms of the biology of it, yeast, which are part of the scoby, the mother that transforms sweet tea into kombucha. Yeast consumes sugars and transforms them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Then there are other organisms in the kombucha mother that are, transforming the alcohol into acetic acid, which is why you typically don't get an accumulation of alcohol. But that's part of the process. Is the yeast's metabolism of sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Now, when you're doing this in the open vessel, and the open vessel with access to a constant flow of oxygen is critical for the health of the scoby and for the functionality of the acetobacter, which are those organisms that are then consuming the alcohol and transforming them into vinegar. The bubbles, are released in that open vessel. So, so the kombucha does not become carbonated, while it's in the open vessel with the kombucha mother. If you drink it at the height of fermentation, you could, get a little bit of a feeling of bubbles dancing on your tongue, perhaps. But what we think of as a carbonated beverage, that's trapped carbonation. So that's carbon dioxide that production that's occurring after bottling. So the tricky part is that like I mean, I love carbonation. I think most people love carbonation. We grew up in a, period of time when, soda was available to us, and we came to like love that feeling of the of the bubbles. But excessive trapped carbon dioxide, the problem with it is it can create a bomb. So, bottles can explode. Bottles do explode. So, if you want to experiment with carbonation of your kombucha or other lightly fermented beverages that still have significant amounts of sugar in them, like the first thing to know is you need to be cautious. You need to monitor them, very closely. I mean, what I typically do is I recycle plastic soda bottles, and I will always do at least one reference bottle anytime I'm trying to carbonate, any of these lightly fermented beverages. I'll always have one of the bottles at least be a plastic bottle, because when you first fill it with liquid, you can squeeze it, and it yields to your squeezing. But as the fermentation continues, as it produces more carbon dioxide, you go to squeeze the bottle, and it resists squeezing, and that's when you know that it's becoming pressurized, and that's when you need to get it into the refrigerator. So, typically the way people get their kombucha or other lightly fermented beverages carbonated is by adding some additional sweetener at the time of bottling to really make sure that there's a significant carbonation. So that might be, adding some sort of a sweetened herbal infusion. It might be adding some fruit juice, even vegetable juice. I mean, that's where a lot of the creativity that we're seeing of, all these different, flavors of kombucha is frequently in the secondary fermentation, adding, sort of something sweet at the bottling stage. So if you don't do that, sometimes you'll get disappointing fermentation, not enough fermentation, but the danger, especially once you're adding more sugar, is getting excessive fermentation. So it's a, it's a balance. It can be tricky. Some people decide to just let the secondary fermentation happen in the refrigerator and leave the bottles for a week in the refrigerator, so they get a slow accumulation of the carbon dioxide. Other people like to leave it out for overnight, 24 hours. It depends a lot on the temperature. If you live in a very hot place, that's going to happen faster. If you're, if your kitchen is at a cool temperature, that could take a much longer period of time. So, I mean, it's hard to be prescriptive in terms of like, this much sugar for this much time. But I mean, basically that's how you get it carbonated, is by adding something else, some sweetener in that after the primary open fermentation at the point of bottling it, and then monitoring it very closely to make sure that the carbonation doesn't become excessive.
Mm-hmm. And Hannah, I know Sandra, it's a really interesting. I like the idea of having a small plastic bottle as a control to control that, because when I've been experimenting at home, I've either just started burping it or not burping it. But like you said, that's kind of a risky proposition, and it's also dependent on if it's warm, if it's cool, all that sort of thing. So the idea of having the plastic bottle as a control is really interesting. And I wonder, Hannah, because some of the other questions that came up were around the actual bottles for kombucha in that secondary fermentation. If you're a home brewer, taking it from that open vessel and putting it into a 1 liter bottle, a 355 ml bottle, an old bottle of kombucha that I just screw on, or a flip top. I mean, seems like there's a million different ways of bottling your kombucha. Does that make a difference in that secondary fermentation? Like, should we pay attention to those vessels?
Well, I think keeping in mind that CO2 is a gas that dissipates is crucial. And then also understanding that what we're getting in kombucha isn't carbonation, it's effervescence. So effervescence to me is that carbonation or bubbles that emerge as a result of a fermentation process as opposed to infusing a liquid with a gas, which is like forced carbonation. And so oftentimes people will be seeking this sort of forced carbonated experience that just doesn't typically happen with kombucha unless there are certain environmental factors present. And so also you can sometimes have bubbles, you put it in the fridge and then they all go away and you're like, what happened to my bubbles? Well, it got cold in there and the yeast slowed down their process. And so oftentimes even just taking it out of the fridge, letting it warm up for a little bit, you'll see those bubbles return. And so this is also why we've seen in the commercial industry, some brands are forced carbonating, some brands are having traditional carbonation, and it can be more difficult when you're taking something that at home has all of these unique characteristics to it and try to standardize it and make it consistent to the consumer every single time. And that's why we see folks or brands rather that will force carbonate in order to yield that consistent carbonation every single time. But in terms of the secret to getting the bubbles, you got to have yeast in there. And so if you're filtering right before you go to flavor, you may not get as many bubbles because the yeast has been removed. Also, if you don't stir the vessel before you decant it and allow the yeast to sort of more evenly get into the mixture, that can also lead to some bottles having no fizz and some bottles being too fizzy. So in order to make that a more even type of process, being conscientious and understanding what it is that leads to the carbonation in the first place, and then being able to sort of dole that out in a more balanced fashion, you'll get better results. And I have to admit, in the many years of brewing kombucha, we have very seldom had bottle bombs, and maybe we're just blessed with great conditions. But we don't put our kombucha in the fridge ever. I tend to and this is in our book, we describe this process, but we tend to harvest it when it's still a little sweet. We flavor it for a couple of days and then we move it into bottles and then we leave it alone for like 2 weeks. And we allow that bottle aging process to dry up the sugars naturally. You don't get that same sort of vinegar type of process because you've taken it away from the mother. And it just creates this really lovely fizz. Now, every once in a while, you do have to be careful when you're opening it, being conscientious. You're not creating a geyser. Nobody likes to clean pieces of fruit off their ceiling or their pretty white top. So being conscientious of that when you go to open it. And that's personally why I like screw tops. I just feel I can control the pressure a little bit. Sometimes you have to like open and close. But a lot of people really like the swing tops because they do hold the pressure a lot better. They have a thicker glass. They can handle some of that pressure building up. But like Sandor says, you do have to be careful and monitor. The bottles I found that are the most explosive.
I seem to have lost you both.
Well, hi, you're here. Are we back?
I think so. We're still here.
Great. Well, so all I was going to say is that I think the beer bottles are thinner glass and tend to be more explosive in my experience. So if you're looking for bottles, reusing kombucha bottles is a great way to start. And then the swing tops tend to be really popular as well.
While are you there, Sandor? We can see you and hear you. While Sandor's figuring that out, Hannah, there's another question about second fermentation in kegs. How does that work?
Well, obviously you can't put pieces of fruit in a keg because it will clog the line. So if you're doing juice or a tisane or something that you don't have to strain, you certainly can then flavor in the keg. They're rated for pressure. They can get some of that pressure building up. You still need some forced carbonation to get it out of the keg, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're carbonating the beverage with that CO2. It's more the pressure of that CO2 is helping to push it out of the keg through the line so it can come through the dispenser into your glass. But certainly you can, if you don't have any material that needs to be strained out, you can certainly just put that flavoring in the keg. Now, here's the thing. I've run into this where people aren't putting their kegs in the refrigerator and then they go to tap them and it just comes out foam. So being conscientious that they do need to be temperature controlled. The best practices at KBI stipulate 40 degrees, which is about 4 degrees Celsius at all times in order to maintain the quality and freshness of the product.
Interesting. There's another one, another question around quality control and quality assurance. Just one sec. Sandra's gonna jump out, and I'm gonna call him back because he has lost his sound. Yeah, Sandra, go ahead, and I'll kick him out for now, and then we'll invite him back. Even though I feel bad for doing that, even though I know I'm going to invite him right back.
You already had to do it for me, so it's all good. Technology, we're done with it. Well, and here's the only other thing I'd say about bubbles is that we are hardwired as human beings to seek out bubbles. Bubbles, since the dawn of time, since men and women have been cultivating ferments, have indicated that nutrition is present. And so we resonate with bubbles, not just because we all grew up drinking soda, but even deeper than that. And this is why I think soda has been able to be so successful, is because it's replacing a natural urge, but unfortunately it's not giving that nutritional payoff, which is what we've come to believe will be our due when we see those bubbles. And I think it's also forced carbonation is what has caused some people to not like bubbles, because they can taste that phosphoric acid. It can have a negative effect on the body. It can deplete the body of minerals. And so then they associate that fake carbonation with a feeling of not being good.
Yeah. And yeah, so I was going to get into the quality assurance and quality control. So this is probably not necessarily for home brewers, but more for those that are commercial brewers or looking to scale in the future. Because I mean, if you're a home brewer, I guess all your quality assurance just relies on your own taste in terms of sugar content and alcohol content, and it's not a big deal because you're just dealing with it yourself.
You're not selling it. Exactly right.
So what sort of tools or resources are there for people who
now I hear you.
we're back.
Yay!
We're just talking about quality assurance and quality control when fermenting kombucha. So Hannah, what sort of tools and information is out there to monitor alcohol content as well as sugar content? Because those are, I think, are the two main quality assurance factors when you're making kombucha.
Well, so I do talk about these factors in the kombucha business presentation, but I'm always happy to go over them again. Critical control points wise, and this is part of your food safety plan, is pH. pH is crucial for indicating that the product is safe from contamination from mold. And that's as a result of this vinegaration process of creating these healthy acids. Of the trace amounts of alcohol that the yeast create are also naturally antimicrobial. And that's really, that unique characteristic of yeast is that ability to create alcohol, which then protects it from other organisms colonizing it. So your pH is really that crucial critical control point for indicating food safety. From there, in terms of creating a balanced flavor profile, Brix is valuable to understand, and that's a measurement of sucrose dissolved in a solution. It's measured through refraction, which is basically a light gets shined through a liquid. The angles at which it bounces off the molecules in the solution then indicate a percent of sweetness or sucrose present. And it's used in a lot of different industries, not just kombucha fermentation, but also for agriculture and understanding the nutrient density of foods and things like that. So Brix is going to be helpful. Now, the thing that we're missing with pH and Brix, because pH will indicate that that it is acidic, but it doesn't tell you how much acidity is present. And so then the third metric for the commercial person is going to be titratable acidity, which is a chemistry set. Basically, there's either expensive equipment that will do all the chemistry for you, or you have less expensive kits where, you're taking some sample, you're adding a buffer solution, and once it reaches a certain color saturation point, based on the number of drops of solution you've added, you go and calculate that to get your titratable acidity. So it's a little more complicated, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But it's really crucial to understanding that balance of sweet and sour, not just in a generic sour sense, but in the amount of acidity that's present in your product. And true, ethanol is one of those things that you do have to monitor from a commercial perspective. And it can be very tricky. So there's no really inexpensive way to do it. They all require some type of expensive equipment investment. Methods that are approved through the KBI AOAC process are an enzymatic method, which requires a photometer. Some some way of reading light. There's a chemical reaction that occurs, and then you apply this piece of equipment to it, and that helps you understand what you're looking at. Or there are sensors, and they can range in price, from my understanding is there's like a less expensive version that's about $14,000. It can go up much higher than that if you're looking at more complex systems, $40,000. So they can be quite an investment. And that's where initially producers will likely send it to a lab, but then over time, as you're needing to test more frequently, it's less expensive to invest in the piece of equipment. And you can find those resources on the KBI website. And if you go and click on the affiliates on our members page, you'll see some of the companies we work with who offer some of that equipment as well. And of course, coming to KombuchaCon, you'll be able to meet the companies and see those products demoed live, and you can make those relationships there in person.
Thanks. So let's talk a little bit about flavor. I know you talked about sour and sweet and controlling that with the sugar and fermentation. So Sandor, when we think of fermentation, even just the simplest, I mean, the first fermented vegetable that I made after I started my kombucha journey was just fermented cabbage. And I watched a YouTube video of you sharing your recipe and your process. And you talk a lot about the magic of fermentation in the presentation, about the biology of it and the chemistry of it. But when we talk about or think about taste, because there's a couple of questions for kombucha, but I'm just trying to think of when we think of fermentation, when we have this fresh cabbage that's a little bit, let's say, bitter, it's crunchy, maybe has a little bit of sweetness, then we have some salt. We put it together and it's salty cabbage, but then when we sit and wait for it, it transforms visually, but also the taste transforms. And so can you talk a little bit about the taste and why it changes from whatever you have as the original ingredients to something completely different taste profile?
Well, sure. I mean, it's exactly analogous to what we just talked about with the the yeast of the kombucha mother consuming sugars and then breaking them down into alcohol and carbon dioxide, and then other organisms coming along, the acetobacter, and breaking down the alcohol into acetic acid. So, I mean, all fermentation involves basically breaking down more complex nutrients into other forms. So in the case of sauerkraut, it's carbohydrates from the cabbage, or if you were working with turnips or carrots or beets, or all vegetables are full of carbohydrates, and the bacteria are breaking those down and turning some of them into lactic acid. So that's where the sour flavor of sauerkraut comes from. But in either of these cases, or really in any case, you can really play with the flavorings. I mean, that's one of the exciting things about doing it yourself. So I just happen to have some props here, but where I live in Tennessee, we have these American persimmons, one of the sort of great delicacies of the world that has zero commercial market. You have to pick them up off the ground under a persimmon tree. And so a friend of mine made a jar of persimmon. And so, made kimchi out of mostly familiar ingredients, Napa cabbage and daikon, and there's garlic and ginger and scallions in it, and chili peppers. But then they added persimmons to it, and it just made it into something completely different. And and to me, this is just like when people make kombucha. When I first was introduced to kombucha, which was about 1994, when there was no such thing in the United States as commercial kombucha. It was this sort of grassroots thing, and sort of a friend of mine had gotten a kombucha mother and was making kombucha and had more and more layers of the kombucha mother, and asked me if I wanted one, and I took one home, and we were just basically doing like tea, sugar, and turning it into kombucha, which is really totally delicious and wonderful. But it was a real revelation to me when I started seeing people take it to new levels by adding fruit juice, by adding different kinds of herbal infusions, having like a turmeric flavored and colored kombucha, having hibiscus kombucha, having carrot kombucha. So like all these things, you can play. Like the only limit to the flavors of kombucha you could create, or the flavors of sauerkraut or kimchi you could create, are your imagination. And really, like, anything that any flavor you love, any flavor you have in great abundance, like, you can find ways to incorporate. And you might need to experiment a little bit. Like, I'm not saying everything you experiment with is going to turn out incredibly well. I definitely encourage people to experiment in small batches, but there's no reason not to experiment. I'll tell you I recently met some people with a fermentation business in upstate New York. And they were a little bit getting back to the basics. They were not adding a lot of like fancy flavorings, but what they were doing is they were using different teas. And they had like all of these interesting, beautiful, oolong teas and lapsang souchong, all these different kinds of teas that they were making fermented beverages out of it. And it was sort of refreshingly simple, but it really highlighted the incredible, like, different flavor profiles of different kinds of tea. I just think that that's one of the exciting things about, about doing this yourself is, just the opportunity to play and try to incorporate, different things that you like into them.
Well, you're hitting the nail on the head, Sandor. I mean, all fermentation is flexible technology. And once you sort of learn the parameters for what your specific organisms, whether it's a kombucha culture or, how to ferment things with salt and getting those right ambient aspects dialed in, I mean, you literally can ferment almost anything with a kombucha scoby. I mean, we're seeing yerba mate kombucha, coffee kombucha, where they're not even using tea at all as the base. I've even seen research papers about milk kombucha, right? So, microbes are magic, and they can do a whole host of really cool things. And because we're talking about food, they're really safe to work with. And so, as Sandor said, it's just your imagination that's limiting those directions. And what's fun about kombucha, because it has that vinegar aspect to it, not only can you go sweet, but you can go savory. So you can get like mushroom and herbal, and even in the book we've got a bacon kombucha. So you can get really creative with your flavorings, and that's what's so fun about it. And just like the kimchis and the different krauts, I'm excited by people's ingenuity, and I think we've barely seen the beginning. And in the kombucha flavors, now we're seeing like hops being put into kombucha. So people who are avoiding alcohol but still want to have that sort of like flavor of beer, these hop flavored kombuchas are really delicious. And we're also seeing, well, now they're getting the CBD kombuchas and the high alcohol kombuchas. So again, we're seeing this creativity manifest not just in people's kitchens, but in the marketplace as well.
It definitely is a great part of it. And I love that. Like I said before, I love cooking. And the one thing I like about cooking versus baking is I like how you can have a recipe as a framework and then experiment and go crazy after that, as opposed to being super scientific and having to follow it. Because if you omit some baking soda, you're not going to have a cake. You're just going to have a pancake or something like that. So I love the experimentation part. And I have to share just a quick little anecdote about encouraging or not encouraging experimentation. I was chatting with Hannah the other day, and I said, Hannah, I'm so excited. I'm experimenting with different sugars. And so I used coconut sugar and palm sugar, and her reaction was, good luck. So that's going to be I haven't tasted it yet, so maybe that'll be my reaction, but who knows, because maybe I'll like it. And that's part of experimenting, is finding your taste and your flavor profile, which is really cool. David from Costa Rica, who's watching right now, said that him and his son are experimenting with vegan sushi using scoby. So he said he calls it scoby.
Nice. That's great.
That's
One of my favorite things is just seeing the clever, creative things people are figuring out to do with their extra scobies. I mean, I've had candies, I've had jerky, I've seen paintings, but I've never heard of a kombucha mother sushi. That's a nice idea. I mean, it's just such an interesting texture to work with, and it can take on all kinds of flavors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's like squid. We have a squid, vegan squid sashimi recipe in the book, and that's exactly it. You can braise it, you can leave it raw, and like you said, that bacterial cellulose is going to soak up any kind of flavor you put on it, and that texture is very similar to squid. And people might wonder, like, well, why would I want to eat a kombucha SCOBY? Is there any nutritional value to it? And it's insoluble fiber. So what that means is our body doesn't digest the bacterial cellulose itself, but it acts like a broom. And this is similar to psyllium husk, which is also insoluble fiber, but it sweeps out excess hormones and sugars on its way out. And so I love using it in fruit leathers because I'm using half the amount of fruit as I normally would. It tastes just as delicious, but I'm also getting that additional benefit from the SCOBY. And now I don't have a countertop full of extra jars of SCOBYs proliferating beyond control.
I think my favorite SCOBY story was when I was in an elevator. I was moving out of an apartment, and this was one of the last things I had to move out, and it was a little SCOBY hotel. And I had it in there, and it was like I was secretly, and it was funny because I wasn't sure if I wanted someone to come into the elevator and have to go through this whole conversation about it, because it was only like 2 floors, because I feel like it's more. But anyway, I was transporting my SCOBY. It was a fun experience. Tiffany, who's online right now, just going back to taste, Hannah, for controlling taste in kombucha. She says that a lot of her kombucha is sour, and it's almost getting too sour. So what are some things that she can do to control that, or just think about along the way to get it less sour? Because I'm assuming she doesn't like the sour taste.
Well, so it is an acetic acid ferment like vinegar, but there are a couple of different things that will impact how sour your kombucha is getting. Of course, time. So the longer you ferment it, the more of the sugars convert into the acid, so that makes it more sour. Another is depending on your method and also where you're taking your starter liquid. So even though we know the yeast and bacteria are in symbiosis, we are the stewards of that balance. They can go out of balance one way or the other if we're not having good practices. And so what I mean by that is, for example, when we do our starter liquid for the next batch, which is basically back slopping from the previous batch, you want to make sure you're taking that liquid off the top of the vessel as opposed to at the bottom where all the yeasty dregs are. So same thing. It's not that you're pouring everything out the top and leaving at the bottom and then adding your sweet tea to that, because you'll end up out of balance with too much yeast, and that leads to too many sour flavors too quickly. Another thing, as I mentioned, is harvest it when it's still a little sweeter and then allow for a bottle aging process. If you have the luxury of time and ability to do that, you'll end up mitigating some of that sourness, but still getting some really delicious dry flavors in there. But yeah, and here's the ironic thing is, once you get too sour, if you think you're going to sweeten it up by putting more juice in there, unfortunately, it actually leads to more acids being formed. So unless you're sweetening it like a glass of iced tea where you're going to immediately drink it, it's oftentimes just going to end up getting more sour. So you can either let it become kombucha vinegar at that point, which is great for your salad dressings, marinades, and heck, it's even a wonderful drain cleaner. So if you have to pour it down the drain, it's still helping to get rid of any slime growing on the sides of your pipes, right? That's what it's doing in our bodies. It's helping to clear everything out. So nothing is ever wasted with kombucha, but certainly it can be disheartening if you have a sour batch. So another way to potentially salvage it is to dilute it with water. So putting a little bit of water, mixing it with water, it is going to change the flavor a little bit, but it also mellows that acidic bite. And you're also getting more water to hydrate and help flush whatever's moving through your body. But typically, it's going back to your process, understanding your variables. Is it too warm? Is it summer? In which case, to try to slow that down, you want to move it to a cooler place. And those kinds of things. And once you dial those in, then you can get a little more control over that flavor profile.
Great. One last question for both of you, because I'm sure go ahead.
I'd just love to address that for 1 second. I mean, I think I love all of Hannah's advice to that, on that question, I mean, I'll just say monitoring it frequently. You might be used to a 10-day process, and then, like a change in the weather means that you wait 10 days and you find it too sour. So I think, in home fermenting kombucha, it's really good to just give it a taste every few days so you can really monitor it closely. And I just want to just put a plug for all the wonderful things you can do if it gets too sour. I sometimes have a batch that it's not really all the way to vinegar, but there's this great new movement of drinking vinegars, and you don't drink them pure. You use a little bit of drinking vinegar with some seltzer or some water, or use it as an ingredient in a cocktail. So I have a jar in my refrigerator of a hibiscus kombucha drinking vinegar, and it's too acidic for me to enjoy drinking on its own, but it's a really wonderful enhancement to a glass of seltzer or a cocktail or things like that. So when life gives you sour kombucha, enjoy it, and remember to check your kombucha more frequently.
When life gives you sour kombucha, make a cocktail so you can forget about it the next day. But I like the idea of reframing that taste profile where, okay, it's too sour, but sure, it's too sour, like you said, to drink as a big pint of it, but maybe it's a concentrate, and maybe you can add it in something else. So kind of reframing it, not being afraid of still using it, and then going back to the drawing board to say, okay, well, if I want to make a kombucha that I can pour over ice and have on a hot summer day for a refreshing drink, then maybe I'll have to dial back the amount of time that it's fermenting, or maybe I'll have to reevaluate the ratios and all that sort of thing. So that's great. And yeah, one last question for the both of you was around scientific references or resources to point to around the idea of the sugar. It says, and let me just read it. Do you have bibliography references that proves the process of sugar going into fermentation, and then also health benefits? So we had a great presentation by Lisa, who's a holistic, registered holistic nurse, and she talked about gut health and the positive effects of kombucha and a little bit of that process. But do either of you have really great references other than your own books and websites to go to either prove or to help give people some more information on that process of the fermentation and the sugars getting eaten during that process? Hannah?
Well, I mean, I think our book is a great place to start. There's a whole appendix in the back that does reference several scientific studies. And then on our website, kombuchacamp.com/research, we have an entire database of scientific studies that have been done on kombucha. So whether that's around a specific health benefit, or it's about, the microbial or the analyte changes throughout the fermentation process, just going there, entering a keyword, it's basically like a curated Google Scholar or PubMed where all of the papers are about kombucha. So basically, we've distilled all that information down for you, made it easy to access. But of course, those other two sites I mentioned are going to be a great reference point as well. So whether you're going to Google Scholar and typing in kombucha and a couple keywords, you're going to find a bunch of different papers, but you'll probably have to read through many of them to find exactly what you're looking for. But what's really great is the commercial industry is leading to more research being conducted. And so there are a couple studies KBI has been involved in with Oregon State University and many of our producers. So you can also go to the Kombucha Brewers website, go to the blog, type in study or DNA study, and you'll find some more information there as well.
Awesome. Sandra, do you have any other scientific references or places to go?
No, I mean, that sounds really good. I mean, I would just point out to people that the study of the interaction between bacteria in foods and beverages that we ingest and our bodies is in its infancy. We are learning more and more, but people have to understand that the methods that have enabled this to be studied, really were developed in the new millennium. Like there is, the methods up until then were about studying individual bacteria, and there were not really ways that we had to study the interaction. And so it's a very sort of rich terrain. One website that I love is microbialfoods.org. And that's a website put up by Dr. Benjamin Wolf, who's at Tufts University and has a laboratory there that's really focused on studying fermented foods and beverages, and and really primarily the dynamics of fermentation. More than the interaction with our own bacteria. I mean, I think it's great that to have people asking these questions, because I will say that like all kinds of claims, some of them unsubstantiated, have sometimes been made on behalf of different fermented foods, but we're beginning to have more and more information. But I think that there really are a lot of open questions. And to my mind, one of the sort of amazing thing about fermented foods and beverages as as therapeutic agents is, even if we don't 100% understand the ways in which they help, there is no risk. We hear all of these pharmaceutical advertisements all the time that that the final seconds of the commercial are telling us all the terrible risks that could happen. I would say that the biggest risk of trying to use fermented foods or beverages for therapeutic benefits is that you don't get the benefit that you were hoping to get,
or you end up in the bathroom.
But I think that they generally, for most people, are totally risk free. I counsel moderation, but there is more and more information, and it sounds like Hannah's been doing a incredible work. Bringing the current research together.
Well, and I think we would both agree that diversity is really the key here anyways. And I think this early research into the human microbiome, as much as our culture and society has been pushed towards seeking the magic bullet or the one thing, the one strain, it really is diversity more than anything else. And that's where not just drinking kombucha, but also eating sauerkraut, getting kimchi, having some miso, trying some tempeh, like getting a wide diversity of these products into your body, allowing the biofeedback you receive from when you consume these foods to tell you, hey, I'm on the right track here, this is making me feel good, it is really the best way forward, because human beings were designed to eat a wide variety of foods. This is why foods are in season at different times and why they're not available at other times. And yet those nutrients are then available in different types of foods. We're not supposed to just eat wheat, corn, and soy all the time. And that is likely what has led to us feeling so bad in the first place. But as much as we can get that diversity, not just of ferments, ideas, concepts into our life, that's what helps us to grow and be a stronger, healthier community, is through diversity.
Well said. So I'm coming to the bottom of my glass of kombucha, and it's everybody's favorite part.
Toss it back.
The best part. So while I'm enjoying the best part, Hannah, we'll start with you, and then to Sandor, and then I'll close it out. But where can we find more information about KBI, Kombucha Camp? Where can we follow you and get more information about you?
Absolutely. Obviously, our website is a great place to start, kombuchacamp.com. We have a free recipe and DIY guide with brewing logs you can download from our site. Our site's going to have a ton of information to help you learn about that. We're all over the social media at Kombucha Camp as well. For KBI, that's Kombucha Brewers International. The website is kombuchabrewers.org. And that's a really fantastic resource for anyone who's in the commercial sphere or looking to go commercial. Read about our lobbying efforts. We've got a great member forum. We've got an amazing conference coming up for you in April in Long Beach. And then our book, The Big Book of Kombucha, aptly named at 400 pages, is available at your favorite bookstore or online. And of course, if you're needing supplies, that's what we are. We're bacteria farmers. We sell kits and cultures, so we'd be happy and honored to get you started with your first kombucha.
Right on. How about you, Sander? If people want to know more about your work and follow you and see where you're going to show up next, sharing your passion of fermentation.
All right. Well, I have a website, which is wildfermentation.com. And I've got links to all kinds of fermentation related resources on there, and post all of my workshops. I teach some workshops here where I live in Tennessee, but then I travel all over. Actually, on Wednesday, I'm flying to Panama to do some workshops in Panama. That I'll be in Kansas at the end of February. So I wind up in all kinds of different places. But you can find out where on my website, wildfermentation.com. I also have 2 books. You can get them on my website or at bookstores or through Amazon or wherever you like to get books. And my books are The Art of Fermentation and Wild Fermentation. And then I also wrote the one that Hannah referred to earlier, The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved, which sadly is out of print now, but you probably could come up with a used copy somewhere. Thank you for having me on this, and it's been a pleasure getting to speak with you both.
It was a pleasure, and I appreciate both of your time and both of your participation in the virtual kombucha conference. We'll have it again. We'll have you on next year. And if you want to see Hannah and Sandor in action at the virtual kombucha conference, you can still get tickets at virtualkombuchaconference.com. And thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.